The Battle of Little Bighorn is one of the most infamous battles in American history, and it's a pivotal moment that still fascinates us today. It's a story of courage, strategy, and tragic miscalculation. In 1876, the United States was expanding rapidly, and the Native American tribes of the Great Plains were in the way. The Sioux and Cheyenne had been living in this region for generations, but the U.S. government saw the land as valuable and wanted it for settlers and railroads. By the end of this video, you will know what really happened at Custer's last stand. It is estimated that between 1,500 and 2,000 Native Americans fought against the U.S. Army at Little Bighorn in 1876. That's an impressive number, but the following figure puts that into perspective. Of the 2,000 Native Americans who fought at the battle, at least 20 died. Maybe as many as 40, but no more than that. Compare that to the U.S. Army side, where at least 264 men were killed, maybe as many as 265, with only one man on the Native American side being taken prisoner. The disparity in casualties is staggering. So how did a vastly outnumbered force manage to defeat one of the most powerful militaries in the world? Let's find out. This is the Battle of Little Bighorn. Before we get going, I just want to say thank you for joining us here at the channel. We love bringing these stories to you, and we hope you enjoy listening to them. If you do, please consider giving us a thumbs up and subscribing. Your support means a lot to us. The year is 1876, and the United States Army is having a pretty good year so far. In the West, Lieutenant Colonel George Armstrong Custer has been chasing the Lakota Sioux and the Cheyenne nations around Montana Territory for several weeks. The U.S. Army was looking to capture the leaders of these tribes and move them to a reservation in Oklahoma. The Native Americans had defeated several detachments of soldiers sent against them, though, and they seemed determined to keep it that way. Custer was born in New Jersey in 1839 and rose to prominence during the Civil War. He was the type of man who sought attention, which he received through his many books and magazine articles about his exploits as a cavalryman. During the war, he helped to liberate the Confederate states of Maryland and Virginia. When the war ended, he was breveted Major General. Brevet means temporary, but in this case it would be the only general stars that Custer would ever hold. His lack of education and his insubordination often got him in trouble, and after the war he found himself without a job. Then opportunity knocked in the form of a letter from the Secretary of War asking if he would take command of the 7th Cavalry, a newly formed regiment made up of black soldiers. While technically inferior to the white regiments due to racial prejudice, the 7th was still one of the most elite fighting units in the Army. While training his new troops, Custer heard reports that gold had been discovered on lands reserved for Native Americans. Miners began pouring onto the land, stealing cattle and resources, killing anyone who tried to stop them. Custer was given command to stop the miners, but he also saw the opportunity to make a name for himself once again. He took the 7th Cavalry north into Montana Territory with orders to find the Native American leaders, Sitting Bull and Crazy Horse, and bring them in dead or alive. As Custer pushed further north, he came across a series of camps where Native Americans had been living. They had all fled when they heard he was coming. One of the camps belonged to a young warrior named Sitting Bull, born into the Hunkpapa band of the Lakota Sioux. Sitting Bull had distinguished himself in battle and become a chief at a young age. He led his people in battles against the U.S. Army for decades, never losing a single man. He was a fierce fighter, but he also knew when to retreat. Sitting Bull was not interested in fighting a pointless battle. He wanted to preserve his people for another day. Sitting Bull didn't know it yet, but he would soon have to face off against one of the most reckless and famous generals in U.S. history. Custer rode hard, splitting his 7th Cavalry Regiment into 3 battalions. He then sent 2 of them back to camp and moved forward with the other, consisting of Major Marcus Reno and Captain Frederick Benteen, hoping to find the Native Americans before they could mount a defense. On June 25th, Custer and his 1,500 soldiers reached the Little Bighorn River. Here, the valley was surrounded by hills and ridges that forced travelers to move along the river. As the sun beat down on his soldiers, Custer decided to wait until the next morning to continue. In the evening, Reno and Benteen rode ahead to scout the area. All they found was a large village occupied by women, children, and the elderly, but no warriors. Feeling confident, Custer ordered his soldiers to spend the night there. Around 10 p.m., scouts from Benteen's group returned to report that they had seen large numbers of warriors riding toward the village. This didn't worry Custer, though, because if what he assumed was true, the warriors had come to protect their families. But he was wrong. When the first light of dawn touched the horizon, it revealed a battlefield. Hundreds of warriors had spent the night just beyond the trees, waiting for the sun to rise. At 4 a.m., they had begun to stir, and now the air was filled with the sounds of preparation for battle. By the time the sun crested over the ridge, the Native Americans were ready. As the light revealed the faces of their enemies, the men of the 7th Cavalry stood up in their stirrups and fired their rifles. The Native Americans responded immediately, firing hundreds of arrows into the U.S. soldiers. The soldiers fell out of their stirrups, mortally wounded, lying on the ground as the Native Americans closed in for the kill. Seated atop his horse, Custer looked around at his men falling like flies and knew he needed to come up with a plan quickly. He shouted for Reno and Benteen, who had fallen back after their initial attack, to reform their lines and charge back into the fray. Instead, both men refused, citing low ammunition and heavy losses. Custer divided his battalion into 3 companies, placing his lieutenant, Major Joel Myrick, in command of one of them. His plan was to ride with Myrick and one other company to a ridge about half a mile away. From there, they would fire on the Native Americans and drive them off. Unfortunately for Custer, his men couldn't keep their horses calm in the face of such a massive onslaught. They started to stampede, causing more casualties, so Custer abandoned his plan. He spurred his horse and charged through the enemy line, firing his saber and pistol as he went. His intention was to reach Reno and Benteen and help them regroup. With all his strength, Custer cut down warriors left and right. For a few moments, it looked as if he might actually succeed in reaching his men, when suddenly a bullet tore into his chest, dropping him like a stone. He slumped over his horse's neck, dead. Captain Caniado, a member of the 7th Cavalry, saw the general fall and turned his horse to follow him. Caniado fought bravely, but eventually ran out of ammunition and was forced to flee on foot. On the ground, he stumbled upon Custer's body and carried it back to safety. No one knows exactly what happened to Custer's remains after that, but legend says that Caniado hid them in a cave where they remain to this day. Meanwhile, Benteen and Reno met up and reformed their battalions, charging once again into the Native American lines. They fought their way to a nearby hill where they set up camp for the night. By the next morning, they had suffered almost 220 casualties. With little ammunition remaining, they retreated to safety. Back at the village, the Native Americans held a victory feast, celebrating their triumph over the U.S. Army. They buried the dead, tending to their wounds and caring for each other. Then they disappeared. No one knows exactly why they fled, but some say it was because they had to move on to find food and supplies. Others say it was because they didn't want to risk another battle with the army. What is known is that they were never able to settle back down in the area again. The U.S. Army had won the war, but it was a Pyrrhic victory. After Little Bighorn, the U.S. government wanted revenge. Thousands of soldiers scoured the land, destroying everything in sight. Anyone who gave them information about the Native Americans received a reward. Then they simply vanished, leaving behind thousands of dead and dying Native Americans. What really happened at Custer's last stand is a complicated question to answer. The official report stated that Reno and Benteen failed to support Custer, abandoning him and his battalion to die. However, evidence shows that they did everything they could to support Custer. Major Reno even risked his life to rescue Custer's body. Also, the report completely ignored the fact that Custer split his battalion in half, which left them without enough manpower to win the battle. Custer was an aggressive soldier who wanted nothing more than glory for himself. Unfortunately, his recklessness resulted in the deaths of hundreds of soldiers. At the end of the day, what really happened at Custer's last stand is that a group of Native Americans fought back against those trying to steal their land. They weren't perfect, but they were fighting for a reason, and sometimes that's all that matters. Thanks for watching. What do you think? Did you learn something new today? Let us know in the comments. And if you haven't already, be sure to check out our related video on the tragic tale of the Edmund Fitzgerald. Until next time, stay safe out there.